Every driver in the Cup Series garage already knew what was coming for Bubba Wallace's pit crew. A loose wheel at Naval Base Coronado, a 2-lap penalty, 2 crew members suspended. NASCAR enforces that rule the same way every single time, for every team, no exceptions. It is, without question, the most consistent call in the sport. Which is exactly why what happens next is so hard to explain. That wheel rule has now cost at least 4 different teams across NASCAR's National Series this season alone. Same violation, same penalty, every time. It is the one part of NASCAR officiating nobody in the garage argues with, because it is the only part that never changes. If you want to understand why Bubba Wallace's penalty is dividing the garage anyway, and why drivers like Kevin Harvick are calling NASCAR's officiating absolute crap in the same breath, this is the full breakdown of the one rule NASCAR gets right, and the system around it that nobody can predict. If you are a NASCAR fan who wants honest technical breakdowns with no fluff and no bias, hit that subscribe button right now. Drop a comment below telling us this: should NASCAR adopt race stewards like other motorsports, or is the current system fine the way it is? And smash that like button so more NASCAR fans who are tired of getting the surface level version find this channel. Now, let's get into it. Here's exactly what happened at Naval Base Coronado. On lap 18 of the Anduril 250, Bubba Wallace's right front wheel came loose and separated from the car. It rolled free during the caution period, and NASCAR held him for 2 laps as a result, nearly 10 minutes sitting in his pit stall while the rest of the field cycled through green flag racing. By most accounts, that should have ended his day. Instead, Wallace clawed his way back through the field and crossed the line second, his best finish of the entire 2026 season. 3 days later, NASCAR made it official. Rear tire changer Adam Hartman and jackman Nathan Ricketts were suspended for 2 races, sidelined through Sonoma and Chicagoland. The violation cited was straightforward, sections 8.810.4, parts A and D of the NASCAR rulebook, the section that governs improperly attached wheels. Here's what matters about that rule. It does not care who you are. It does not care what team you drive for, how many championships you've won, or how big your sponsor is. A wheel either stays on the car or it doesn't. Earlier this season, Ross Chastain's crew took the exact same penalty after a wheel came loose at Circuit of the Americas. Ben Rhodes and his Thor Sport team got hit with it at Nashville. Katherine Legge's Live Fast Motorsports crew got it at Charlotte during the Coca-Cola 600. 4 different teams, 4 different races, 1 identical penalty, applied the exact same way every single time. Nobody in the garage calls that one unfair. Nobody appeals it, because there's nothing to argue. The wheel was loose, or it wasn't. That's the whole point. NASCAR's enforcement here isn't just consistent. It's mechanical, in the truest sense of the word, and that consistency is exactly what makes everything else in this sport stand out by comparison. It's also worth noting what doesn't happen in these cases. No team has gone public complaining the penalty was unfair. No driver has called the rule into question. The silence around the wheel rule is its own kind of evidence. Compare that silence to almost anything else NASCAR rules on, and the contrast gets sharper fast. The wheel rule survives scrutiny because it asks nothing of the people enforcing it except to look at a video and confirm whether a part separated from a car. There's no version of that conversation where 2 reasonable officials watch the same footage and land in different places. Strip away every other variable in this sport: the politics, the history, the rivalries, the storylines, and the wheel rule still works exactly the same way. That's rare in any officiated sport, and it's worth sitting with for a second before moving to everything that doesn't share that quality. But here is the thing most people still get wrong about NASCAR officiating. It is not that the sport is inconsistent everywhere. It is that the sport is perfectly consistent in exactly one place, and almost nowhere else. And once you see the difference between those 2 categories, you cannot unsee it. There are really 2 kinds of penalties in NASCAR, and they could not work more differently. The first kind is objective. A wheel comes off, or it doesn't. A part weighs what it's supposed to weigh, or it doesn't. These calls get made by a sensor, a scale, or a piece of video that leaves no room for interpretation. The second kind is subjective. Did a car cross the yellow line before the start-finish line? Did a driver jump a restart before the control car released the field? Did a radio comment cross from frustration into a threat? These calls require a human being to watch a camera angle, in real time, under race pressure, and decide what they saw. And that's where the consistency falls apart. Take what happened to Joey Logano at Phoenix earlier this year. NASCAR penalized him for crossing the yellow line before the start-finish line, sending him to the back of the field and wrecking his strategy. On the surface, fine, that's a real rule. But Kevin Harvick, watching from the broadcast booth, wasn't having it. He went on his own podcast afterward and tore into the call directly. Those inconsistencies, he said, like when they didn't make that call with Denny at Richmond, that's the kind of crap I'm tired of. I'm tired of the inconsistencies that go with the officiating. It has been absolute crap. That's the whole complaint. In one quote, Harvick wasn't arguing the Logano call was wrong on its own. He was arguing that NASCAR had let a nearly identical situation slide just weeks earlier, with a different driver, on a different track, and nobody said a word. Same rule, same kind of moment, two completely different outcomes. That's not a one-off complaint from a disgruntled fan account. That's a former Cup Series champion, on the record, naming the exact two incidents and asking why one got punished and the other didn't. It doesn't stop with restart zones and yellow lines. At Watkins Glen, Preece got into it with Ty Gibbs on track during a tight battle in Stage 2. Preece, frustrated, said some things over his own team radio about how he intended to race Gibbs going forward. NASCAR's competition officials reviewed it, decided the comments crossed from venting into a stated intent to retaliate, and hit Preece with a $50,000 fine and docked him 25 points, dropping him a spot in the standings. RFK Racing announced they'd appeal. Now, whatever you think about what Preece said, here's the actual issue. That penalty wasn't triggered by anything he did on the racetrack. It was triggered by what he said about what he might do. That requires NASCAR officials to interpret tone, intent, and follow-through in real time based on a radio transmission. Compare that to a wheel falling off a car. One of those calls is a measurement. The other is a guess about what's in someone's head. There's a reason these two cases keep surfacing as examples instead of fading into the background like most penalty disputes do. Both involve drivers with real standing in the garage, not rookies still earning their voice. Both got appealed or publicly challenged within days, and both forced NASCAR to explain a decision after the fact rather than simply pointing to a rulebook section and moving on. That pattern, a penalty followed by public pushback, followed by NASCAR having to clarify its reasoning, almost never happens with wheel violations. It happens constantly with judgment calls. Even the people inside the sport are saying this out loud now. Brad Keselowski, co-owner of RFK Racing and a former champion himself, was asked about exactly this kind of gray area after a difficult restart zone call earlier this season. His answer was blunt. He said the line is always moving, that he's done a lot of jobs in this sport, but never wanted to be the one making those calls, and that he'd genuinely like to see NASCAR adopt dedicated race stewards, the way some other motorsports series do, specifically because judgment calls like that are so difficult to get right in real time. That's not a fan in the comments section. That's a team owner who races against these calls every single weekend, saying the current system asks officials to do something close to impossible. It's worth pointing out how unusual that is. Team owners rarely criticize officiating publicly because they still have to deal with that same officiating every single weekend for the rest of the season. When someone in Keselowski's position says the quiet part out loud anyway, that's not a small thing. It suggests the frustration inside the garage has reached a point where staying quiet costs more than speaking up does. So why does this gap exist in the first place, and why hasn't NASCAR closed it? Some of it traces back to a structural decision the sport made over a decade ago. When NASCAR shifted to video-based officiating, it reduced the number of officials physically stationed around the track, leaning instead on a smaller team reviewing camera feeds and replays from a central hub. Picture how that actually works on a race weekend. A handful of officials are sitting in front of monitors, cycling through dozens of camera angles, while a 38-car field is racing live in front of them at over 180 miles an hour. For an objective call, that setup is perfect. A wheel separating from a car shows up clearly on video, every time, from almost any angle, with no ambiguity at all. But for a judgment call, that same setup becomes a liability. The angle available in the moment might not show the full picture. The replay might be a few frames too late, and the official making the call has seconds, not minutes, to decide something that could change the outcome of the race. Fewer eyes, more interpretation, and almost all of the controversy ends up concentrated in that second category, every single week. Here's a detail that proves the point better than any complaint from a driver. NASCAR has a formal appeals process, the National Motorsports Appeals Panel, and in 2026 alone, it has heard contested penalties nearly every month of the season. Behavioral penalties, inspection disputes, judgment calls drivers and teams felt were applied unevenly. Wheel violations almost never show up on that list, because there's nothing to appeal when the video shows a tire rolling down the front stretch. But the subjective calls land in front of that panel constantly, which tells you, in the clearest way possible, exactly which part of NASCAR's officiating the garage actually trusts, and which part it doesn't. There's one more layer specific to 23XI racing that's worth being honest about. This isn't the first time this team's relationship with NASCAR has been under a microscope. 23XI, co-owned by Michael Jordan and Denny Hamlin, spent more than a year in federal court suing NASCAR over antitrust claims tied to the charter system, a case that only settled in December of last year, with both sides standing on a courthouse step calling it a fresh start. That history doesn't change anything about Wallace's wheel penalty, which was applied exactly the same way it's been applied to every other team this season. But it does mean that any penalty involving 23XI now gets read by fans and media through a lens that other teams simply don't carry. A wheel penalty for Ross Chastain reads as routine. The identical penalty for Bubba Wallace gets framed as suspicious, not because the facts are any different, but because the relationship between this team and NASCAR has a much longer, much more public history of friction behind it. So what does all of this actually mean going forward? For Wallace and the 23 team, it means racing the next two events at Sonoma and Chicagoland with a short-handed pit crew, right at the moment he was finally building momentum, coming off his best finish of the year and trying to climb out of 11th in the championship standings. Every pit stop over these next 2 weeks carries extra risk with replacement crew members who haven't had the reps, and in a sport where a single slow stop can cost a driver 4 or 5 positions, that risk is not small. For the broader garage, it means the pressure for clearer standards isn't coming from outside the sport anymore. It's coming from inside it, from team owners and former champions who are on the record saying the current approach to judgment calls isn't working. And for NASCAR itself, the stakes only get higher from here. A wheel penalty in June costs a team 2 crew members for 2 races. A missed or inconsistent judgment call during the playoffs, when one caution or one restart decision can decide who makes the next round, could cost a team an entire championship. That is the gap NASCAR still hasn't closed, and it is not going to get easier to ignore the deeper this season goes. NASCAR built the most consistent rule in the sport by removing judgment from it entirely. A wheel either stays on the car or it doesn't. Everything else, they still leave to a person, in a booth, making a call in real time. Bubba Wallace's penalty was never the problem. It was just the one call this season nobody could argue with. So drop your take in the comments. Should NASCAR bring in dedicated race stewards to handle judgment calls the way other motorsports do, or does the current system just need better consistency? There's no wrong answer here. We want the real debate. If you want NASCAR breakdowns that go past the penalty report and into what actually happened, subscribe right now. And next week, we're breaking down the exact restart zone call at Phoenix, where the data shows Logano and Hamlin were in nearly identical positions, and what that tells us about how these calls actually get made.